Well, I actually didn't see the stat. I came up with the stat myself and just reviewing the recruiting rankings from this most recent class in 22. And this is really sobering to second tier college football teams that are looking to get to the playoff, win national championships, and compete with the elite. Okay. If your name's not Alabama, Ohio State, Georgia, etc., Kentucky was 13th in the nation in recruiting. They are the 13th rated class in the country. The gap between Texas A&M at 1 and Kentucky at 13 was the same gap as between Kentucky at 13 and 75.
Wow.
And it's like that about every year. That's like the gap between like 1 and 8 is like between like 8 and 25 or 30. Like it's those 3 or 4 get just ridiculous classes.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, and I think one of the things that when you talk about the middle tier of the SEC versus the middle tier of the Big 12, I think the one thing, and I agree,
Not
Matt.
to interrupt you, Jason. That's what I was jotting down here. I was checking Matthew on his just his tiers of teams, and I was going to come up with an argument point there, but keep going, Jason. Sorry.
No, you're fine. But I was thinking, a team like Arkansas, they are in a very, very upward trajectory right now based on what they've done through the transfer portal, based on what their recruiting class looks like this year. And I think they've got a really good guy in there, Pittman, from a head coaching perspective. So I think when you look at TCU from a Big 12, they've kind of went down a little bit over the last couple of years. So when you kind of compare some of those middle tier teams of the Big 12 versus some of those middle tier teams of the SEC, it kind of appears to be a little bit stronger on the SEC level. But I think the point that Matt made a minute ago is very, very important, and something that we need to make sure that we all remember here is that you're absolutely right. Oklahoma or Texas, they're not going to be playing Alabama, Georgia, Florida, LSU every single year, especially with what's probably going to be some sort of a pod system in the SEC. They're not going to play that game, so it's not the complete murderer's row. Yes, it's tougher than the Big 12, absolutely, but it's not going to be the murderer's row that some people kind of perceive that it might be.
Yeah, and the pod that's talked about for us, I welcome that tremendously. I mean, if it's Arkansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and Texas A&M, I'll take that. I think that's a very favorable pod to what could be, what could have been. Like, if I don't want to be in a pod with Alabama, I don't want to be a pod with Georgia, I don't want to be a pod with LSU, I'll take those 3 teams over those 3 teams.
So, yeah, I'm trying to divide the conferences. So I took, and it's difficult because obviously you've got a difference between what we saw on the field last year versus where the programs stand. Texas is probably the most difficult program to place in the Big 12 because what tier do they belong in? Well, the recruiting tells us one thing and the play on the field tells us another thing. So obviously this past season, Oklahoma, Baylor, and Oklahoma State were the class of the conference. There's no question about that, but Baylor's one season removed from 2-7. So again, it's kind of difficult to gauge, not everyone's Alabama where the consistency is right here. And that's what they are, or even Oklahoma State in a different way. They're kind of consistently 8-4. I know they were better this past year, of course. So looking at the top tier currently in the SEC, again, from a potential standpoint and recruiting standpoint, you could put Texas A&M and LSU there, but they're not playing like it. It's Alabama and Georgia. So your second, then you throw out Kansas and Vandy at the bottom of each league. There's nobody close to either one of them from a incompetency standpoint. So in the middle, and I know that there are various tiers within the middle, but they're even kind of difficult to differentiate as well. And also to defend the Big 12, when you're comparing the Big 12 and other conferences, especially one of the 14 team conferences, and you're just looking for good teams. Well, you got to understand there's only 10 versus 14. So it's going to be more difficult to find good teams because that's 40% more teams in the SEC. So, this next tier for the Big 12, if you take those 3 out, looks a little weak with Iowa State, TCU, Texas, West Virginia, Kansas State, Texas Tech. It's kind of difficult to differentiate all those schools. For me, it is. Iowa State's been better. generally, but they're only coming off a 7-6 campaign. And again, I took 3 big boys out of the Big 12, and I only took 2 out of the SEC. So I left 12 in the SEC, and I only left 7 in the Big 12. So again, tough comparison. But when you look at that collection of teams versus Texas A&M, Arkansas, Tennessee, Florida, LSU, Kentucky, Ole Miss, Arkansas, even Mississippi State, that's a lot of good teams.
Yeah, no, it definitely is. I mean, I think, to what we've talked about, and Mark, me and you have talked about this on a lot of occasions, that yes, it's not necessarily murderer's row, but at the same time, you in the SEC, you've got to be ready to play every single week, because it's so from top to bottom, there's so many of these teams that can get you, and it's not necessarily the same thing at the Big 12. Yes, you've got some of these teams that are capable of beating you, but exactly the point that you've made about maybe Kansas State, TCU, Texas Tech, some of those guys that are in the middle tier versus a Kentucky, a Mississippi State, and Ole Miss, Arkansas. I think those are it's a much better, it's a much bigger step up in class.